analysis. This meeting is being recorded. Okay, so welcome to today's game crit and analysis session. We have 4 varied and interesting papers. The first 2 will be full, which will get a 15-minute slot for both presentation and questions. So it's up to you guys to decide how much time you need for questions. And the last 2 will be short papers. Okay, so without further ado, let's have Bjarke and Henrik start, please.
All right, I'll be doing the presentation, so I'll share. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Welcome to my talk, Making a Player the Detective. I'm Bjarke. I will soon be a PhD in computational media at UC Santa Cruz, but I'm not there yet because of the world right now. But anyways, this is work done as a research assistant at Aalborg University in Denmark. So I want to talk about detective games. Specifically, I want to talk about how even while we've used detective settings a lot in games, from Gabriel Knight to Sherlock Holmes to L.A. Noire, and even used it in academia as a metaphor, how to talk about play, for example, how Henry Jenkins talk about the play as a detective environmental storytelling. Video games rarely actually let you fully become a detective. So what do I mean by that? Clara Fernandez-Vara, who's done a lot of work on detective games, looked at Sherlock Holmes games specifically, and found that a lot of them were fairly typical adventure games with the lock and key puzzles that progress the story, but don't necessarily require any deduction or actual detective work to perform. Serena Formica, who did similar work on Poirot, has this point that it's only really when Poirot agrees with the questionings and conclusions of the player that they are allowed to progress. This is an example from a Sherlock Holmes game from 2014 where I'm getting these options as a player, but if when I select the wrong one, this pops out in my face, which feels like I'm being careened down a path rather than performing necessarily the entire investigation myself. So I want to be playing as this guy, I want to be playing as Sherlock Holmes, but it feels more like I'm playing as the Watson character. And this is what Formica calls playing the secretary. So what we're looking for here is what Clara Fernandez-Vara calls proceduralizing the acts of the detective. So instead of following a specific case and following that case to a T, we want to take the individual actions that a detective like Sherlock Holmes does and do them ourselves. And this is stuff like examining and interpreting evidence and modeling insight thinking and exposing lies and following leads. I have more detail on these specifically in the paper, but I don't have time to go into them. Oops, sorry about that. Before we continue on games, though, I want to take a brief detour into detective fiction to understand how detective stories work, because that'll make it clearer how these games actually work. So in detective stories, there's this delineation between 2 different stories. There's the first story, which is the story of the crime, which has typically already happened when we're starting the novel or the story, and then the second story, which is the story of the investigation, which is the uncovering of this first story. Todorov, who also did this delineation of 3 different genres of detective stories. The whodunit, which is the classical Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie story. This is the most puzzle-like, the most game-like almost. It has very static, simple character, and the first story is very clearly in focus. And the second story is sort of merely an uncovering. The thriller is sort of exemplified by the American hard-boiled detective stories of Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. It's much more of an adventure story. There's much more unclear solutions, the muddy characters. The second story is much more in focus, and the criminal can even continue to influence the second story after they've performed the first. Then there's the suspense story, which I'm not going to spend too much time on here. This is essentially a mix of the 2. The story of the crime is still kept intact, but the focus is rather on the uncertain future of the characters. The other point I want to bring up is this from Peter Hyun, who did a narratological reading of detective fiction, where he talks about how detective stories are about deciphering plots. And the point of a detective story from a detective's point of view is to reconstruct a narrative of a crime. So the story of the crime consists of action, whereas the story of the investigation is concerned with knowledge. This is a visualization I did of his primary points, where you can see here that the criminal authors the first story, which a detective then reads through enacting the second story, which is about reading the first. a narrator character, this is like exemplified in, for example, the Watson character, then reads the detective doing doing what they do and narrates that through a piece of fiction to us, the reader. All right, now that we have these things explained, I want to go back to games. Because if we look at the games that Clark and Formica looked at, if you look at them again, we can see that they're actually much more concerned with the depiction of the second story rather than the uncovering of the first. And the player's role here is to sort of unfold the second story, not necessarily to uncover the first, but rather uncover the first in a way that's already been determined. So in a sense, these are perhaps more thrillers or suspense stories rather than whodunits, which is what they seemingly look like. And this is also something that Clara Fernandez talks about in a paper from 2015, where she mentions that these detective games might be more similar to more modern styles of detective fiction rather than the whodunits they say they are when they say that it's a Sherlock Holmes game. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. This is just a different genre of detective story that can also work, but we just have to be aware of what they are. So we are, as a player on these games, we're actually more playing as the narrator role. We're not playing as the detective, but we're instead over here. Note also that the player in this chart is on 2 different spots on this, and I'll get back to that later. But let's consider a game where we are playing, where we do play as a detective. What would that mean? Well, that would mean that we are supposedly enacting the second story, which means that we should be primarily concerned with reading the first. But I want to keep in mind that that the other type of detective story can still work, which is why I'm defining 2 different types of genres of detective games, 2 different styles of detective games, which is puzzle box adventure game and puzzle box detective game and adventure detective game. So puzzle box detective game is where we are proceduralizing a whodunit by letting the player be the primary performer as a detective and letting them enact the story of the investigations. And there will be examples in a little bit. An adventure detective story is a game that involves detective stories and mysteries, but focus on telling the story of an investigation. It might involve detective work, but it doesn't have to. Whereas a puzzle box detective game is primarily defined by the action, by the verbs, by what the player is doing, similar to how a shooter or platform is defined by the primary verbs of the player. And an adventure detective game is then primarily defined by its content. It is a subset of adventure games with the story content being about detectives doing work. So note that these 2 genres are actually quite different in how they're defined and what makes them a quote-unquote detective game. So even if they both fit in that broad umbrella, they're not necessarily there for the same reason, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive either. And detective work, I'll also mention, is even broader still. Like there can be detective work outside of a detective game entirely. And it can also be argued that these 2 genres are just subsets of the larger genres of puzzle and adventure. And I will also admit that the lines blur quickly between game. If I look at a game, I can see elements of both in a lot of games. Yeah, a game can have both an adventure element and a puzzle elements. But I want to bring up some examples of games that I consider to be almost pure puzzle box games, because these are the ones less talked about so far. So these are the 3 games that I bring up in the paper: Her Story, Return of the Obra Dinn, Outer Wilds. And these I would consider to be pure puzzle box games, puzzle box detective games. And I don't have time to go through each of them in detail and how they work, but there's stuff on that in the paper if you're interested. And these are a game that gives you a mystery and an unsolved first story, and then leave you in a world to solve it by yourself. Her Story gives you a database of video interviews to watch in any order and with a bad search interface. Return of the Obra Dinn gives you 60 missing people on a ship and tasks you to figure out what happened to each of them. Outer Wilds gives you a solar system with a dead species and asks you to find out what they were looking for and what happened to them. And these are games that don't end until the player solves the mystery. They're all games that require detective work to do so. Each requires piecing together information from disparate parts, looking at the clues in words and the environment, and trying to guess which are lies and which are not, and trying to understand the patterns of what's going on. These are all games where the player is primarily reading the first story as it's laid out for them, and the second story doesn't exist until the player begins reading and playing the game, and thus they act as a detective. A modern counterexample I'll bring up is a game like Disco Elysium, which is very adamantly, almost staunchly not a puzzle box game. It it is still a very successful detective story, but it is almost purely about the story of, in this case, it almost doesn't care about its murder. But it cares much more about the outcomes of the characters and the political landscape that led to the murder, and how each character tries to take advantage of it, and you, the detective in the world. So the final major thing I want to talk about is the structure of detective games, and him again talking about the puzzle box detective games, because they all have a kind of a similar structure, and this is outlined by Elin Kastenstadje as the hidden structure, or by Marie Lorraine as the hidden story structure. And these are games where the structure of the game is hidden from the player. The game intentionally obfuscates or hides its path, and it's not clear how to progress from one point to the next, or how the parts of the game are, or how the parts of the story are connected. And much of the challenge of these type of games comes from navigating the structure that you cannot see the entire map of. And this is the detective work. You have to make assumptions and follow leads without necessarily being able to see the full picture. This echoes the idea that detective work is about uncovering knowledge, and as the knowledge of where to go and which lead to pursue next is part of the work. And without this hidden structure, much of the path becomes obvious, and there's much less deduction required in order to uncover the clues. And then even if we are learning new clues, we're not necessarily performing as a detective to uncover those clues. And therefore, I would say that we would say that a hidden story structure is a requirement for a puzzle box detective game. And the game needs to allow for a lot of detective work to happen in the player's minds, and only be sort of the facilitator for mystery. Give the player the ability to discover, manage, and reassess clues, but not necessarily determine when and where how the player finds them, and crucially, when and where the player solves the entire mystery. The key difference between puzzle box detective games and whodunit fiction is that puzzle box detective games do not necessarily reveal the murderer in the end until, if the player has not realized it, but sort of waits until the player is ready with the script. In Peter Hune's language, the reader and the super reader almost collapse into one, as the player accesses both simultaneously. The first story isn't read until the player is reading it, and thus they're completing the loop by themselves for themselves. One final word of caution: whodunits has some historical, unfortunate social implications, because using a pure puzzle box logic to describe the world will often fail to describe the actual muddiness, contradictions, and accidents, and contradict all of the simplicities that happen in real life. It'll forget the outliers. It'll forget the margins. It'll forget it has a tendency to sometimes make the world seem too neat. It is not something I see these three games doing, but it is a thing to be aware of. Finally, before I end, I just want to shout out two things I found after writing the paper that I think are relevant. First of all, is Tom Francis' notion of information games. He made a design talk off in 2019. And this is, he talks about an information game being a game about learning information using previous information. And this is, a lot of the games talk about are similar to the ones I bring up, and it's a very similar idea and it's a very similar idea. And I think the key thing here is this idea of learning information using previous information. I think is a pretty important and powerful insight. And finally, I want to just mention some more games I found. These are games I all played at a demo at a Steam festival in spring that all seem to be doing some of this more puzzle boxy detective-y work, which is cool. Paradise Killer just released, I think. The other two are still unreleased. But it seems like to be a thing that indie game developers are starting to do a lot more of. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Bjarke. So we can take one or two questions. The first one comes from Adrian Galia. Anyone else has questions, please type them in the chat or raise your hand. Is there a single truth outcome? Do the outcomes have different consequences?
Yeah, good question. It depends on the game, I would say. I think in a game like Her Story, I think most people who's played Her Story has a fairly non-variant idea of what's going on. Same with Outer Wilds, but and return to them. But a game like the one I have screenshot of here, Crimes and Punishments, kind of has this ability to sort of, you can, as a player, choose to judge the cases differently. You can choose whether you want to condemn the criminal or let them go, or you can kind of choose which. But there is still, the game still after that still determines whether the answer was right or not. So in most of these cases, I would say that there's a quote unquote right answer, but it doesn't. I can still envision a game where that is not necessarily the case, or where the answer is not necessarily given.
Thanks, Bjarke. We'll have to move on to the next paper now. It's Kirk.
All right, let me share my screen real quick. Okay. Can you all see me?
Yes, can hear you clearly. Please start.
All right, so hello everybody. My name is Kirk Lumblade and I'm a doctoral candidate in the Text and Technology program at the University of Central Florida. I'm here today presenting my research on the history of a particular vein of game scholarship, that addressing history and games. This area has evolved and cohered over the past 2 decades into a field of its own, historical game studies, and I wanted to take a closer look at it. So overall, this project does a number of things. Primarily, it examines the evolving scholarship on historical games along temporal, discursive, object of study, and disciplinary dimensions. From this, it provides temporal discursive groupings which illustrate the different threads of historical game studies and how they've changed over time. So what is historical game studies? HGS is, broadly speaking, a field organized around the study of how games and gameplay engage with discourses about history and the past. This field has evolved from what I would describe as merely the study of history in games to the study of games and gameplay as history before truly arriving at my original definition. In examining this field, I wanted to ask a few more specific and formal questions which would help me understand how these shifts occurred. These questions were primarily centered around the field's boundaries, its key questions and scholarly provocations, as well as how it responds to those interrogatives over time. I did this through an iterative process, which started with a close reading of a recent, explicit formative text which formally established the new field. I traced this text citations back, with the citations being iteratively further traced as well as coded along the dimensions mentioned previously, looking for texts that address the intersection of history and games, and thus might be considered HGS scholarship. From that work, these are the temporal periods and discursive groupings I found to be illustrative and helpful in understanding the field's progression. We'll begin at the beginning and introduce our different threads along with the different periods. So in the beginning was civilization. This early period of scholarship is largely characterized by no single focus beyond a small, coherent set of objects of study. Like that proverbial ephemeral year in grade school where the jocks and the nerds both played with the same toys, here we have scholars of many different stripes examining the same things. Over time, they'll largely go their separate ways, but for now, they look at Civ. 2 threads emerge here: our close reading scholarship and the study of historical games as pedagogical instruments. The close reading group takes individual, or occasionally a small set of games, and applies methods of textual analysis in order to unpack and explore the concepts and ideas presented through said game. This group borrows heavily from traditional humanities scholarship as well as its game studies descendants. The second early focus for these games was not as a text per se, but as a pedagogical tool. The historical games and learning group wants to interrogate how players in many settings learn historical concepts and develop understandings of historiography and history from their play. This thread is generally a lot more practical, with scholarly work here generally providing case studies and design principles for other educators. Both of these groups in their early years are looking at these games as sources of historical content to be unpacked, either into a reading of the game's underlying ideology and biases, or as educational content for a history classroom. Next, we have a period where the scholarship took a bit of a wider focus. Some broad formal work from media studies and historiography steps into the ring and begins to ask questions about historical games as a whole, as well as begins to categorize and theorize about these games. As such, one thread emerges here. These scholars are beginning to think about games, historical games, as history. Of course, the conversation surrounding games and media has been going on for some time, with historians Robert Rosenstone and Hayden White previously interrogating the role of film in history. In this discourse, White proposes two critical questions. These questions essentially are asking A, what are the affordances of historical film? And B, can historical film support the aims of historical scholarship? In 2005 and 6, we see this discourse ported over to historical games, with two major media studies scholars, Alexander Galloway and Bill Arricchio, weighing in with answers to White. To reduce a decade-plus debate to a few sentences, Galloway says no, as he sees the inherent algorithmic ideology as overriding any historical value, whereas Arricchio gives a qualified yes, since he sees digital games as tied to the broader rise in post-structuralist historiography, while he also begins to sketch out the historical affordances of these games and how they might differ game to game. This thread continues with later scholarship, so much scholarship, buttressing Arricchio's arguments by, among many approaches, examining how agency and player choice blur the traditional boundaries between the scholar, historian, and audience in ways recognizable to this particular historiographic tradition. This period begins a discursive thread that sees commonality in the previously disparate objects of study and begins to define both the characteristics of those objects and the boundary between them and non-historically relevant objects of study as well. This is also where a number of key terms and theoretical constructs in the field emerge. So part 2 of our saga saw our objects of study being considered as a larger set. Part 3 sees our related scholarship being treated the same. It's here that we see some early criticism, not just of individual works, but of larger bodies of work which were implicitly connected into one area of study. Though not explicitly connected to this development of the field, it's around this time that our story gets an inevitable and important spinoff, a series which looks at how game players act as historians. This group just starts to emerge here, though it really doesn't get going until 2013 or so. This Gamers as Historian groups follows up on the agentive, authorial, often scholarly role given to players of historical games, which again is essential to the argument that these and other scholars are making about the form's historiographic, or perhaps historioludic value. As such, it shines a light on what those players are actually doing. This group looks at historical practices found in player communities, communities in which what we think of as the game forms a central and pivotal, but far from complete, piece of the picture. This might include scholarly engagement with how player communities develop game mods in opposition to or in alignment with particular understandings of game and history, or it might examine how player communities trace their own history of their own play experiences within and surrounding games. Also emerging here is our historical period studies group, one which looks at how historical concepts are broadly presented, either across many games or as part of a multimedia analysis which places games alongside those other media. This group is distinctly historical in character, sharing objects of study with some of the other areas, but preferring to ground the work in historical theories and methods from the get-go. So again, this period largely expands the sphere of concern for historical game studies, integrating examinations of play and player practice into its efforts to implicitly group and respond to extant scholarship. And then we have episode 4, a new field. It's here that historical game scholarship really comes into its own, with recognition occurring on multiple fronts. We see the first major scholarly anthology focused on the historical study of games, major monographs tackling the challenge of building a theoretical grammar appropriate to the field's core questions, as well as the formal, explicit recognition of the new field via a special issue in the journal Rethinking History. This is largely the field's synthesis, with a theoretical grammar specifically for historical game studies emerging in force. And finally, we reach the field's formal establishment. This particular research project, my work, largely ends here, but there are some recent developments that you may find worth examining. And that's just about it. Having just about reached our end, I wanted to mention a few final takeaways with one final slide. Just kidding, it's never just one. So our first takeaway is that historical game studies and its attendant discourses on history in the past involve more than just games which explicitly contain direct historical reference. This begins with Ferguson's idea of the counterfactual, which promotes historical exploration of possible historical outcomes other than our own, but exists on a spectrum extending to the more fantastical and allegorical as well. Historical game studies also illustrates how players' historical understandings might impinge upon and alter behavior in a variety of game-related contexts, some of which may be quite unexpected. These practices often wind up blurring the lines between mediums, with elements of film genre, game, and web media blurred together into a historical amalgam. HGS also demonstrates how the affordances of historical gaming increase the agency of historical players, blurring the line between player and historian. This is often, not always, a good thing. And that's it. Any questions?
We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Please raise your hands or type in the chat. I'll roll one out myself until others come in. I'm curious as to what led you to this bit of research. Did you feel like we needed a snapshot of this area, or what led you to this exercise?
I originally, early on in my graduate studies here, started writing a paper looking at a particular game and how it handles themes of colonialism, which of course is a major thread in game scholarship. And I just kind of followed the rabbit hole down of looking for scholarship that treated it not just as a game, but also as a form of history. And then I hit upon sort of these core threads here and really started digging them out.
Okay. We have a question from Tess Watson. Could you comment on your choice of title for the paper? Civilization. Used this term once in your full paper, but was wondering if you could comment on this choice.
Well, I largely chose it because, like broader game studies, there's a period where Sid Meier's Civilization is talked about extensively. It's high up. I think, was it Froman Martin last year, DIGRA did a citation analysis to see which games were most cited. It's high up in game studies, and in historical game studies in those early years, to say it dominates would be an understatement. Every single scholarly work that I could find was looking at Civ. Or, sorry, there were 1 or 2 that looked at Civ and Age of Empires or very related game. So it started out with a very narrow scope. So I see that also as part of the field's evolution, is moving beyond just looking at the very obvious candidates, of which Sid Meier's Civilization is first.
Okay. Thanks for that, Kirk. We have to wrap it up here. Great paper. And we now move on to Daniela and Emin, and the video will start shortly.
Hello everyone, my name is Daniela De Angeli. I'm a research associate at the University of Bath in the UK. I'm part of Camera, the Center for the Analysis of Motion, Entertainment Research and Applications. Today I will be presenting my review of which methodologies are used in game research. I did this review because I entered the field of game research quite recently, and I was looking for methods for measuring player experience, and in particular the impact that games have on players. And I realized that the field is still very young and lacks a common set of methods and techniques. As I was wondering which methods to use for my own studies, I decided to investigate what other researchers were doing. So I reviewed publications from 4 key venues in game research: the conference Skyplay, DIGRA and FDG, and the journal Games and Culture. We took in consideration papers published between 2013 and 2018 in those venues for a total of 1,522 papers. I looked at the methodology of each paper using in vivo, and I searched for all occurrences of words or phrases related to which methods and tools were used, and also how many participants were recruited and how. So let's start with the methods. So as we can see from this word cloud, surveys were the most used method to collect data, followed closely by interviews. The first were used 350 times, while the interview were used 242 times. We found also a number of case studies, so 182 papers discussing, for example, the design of new kind of games. Other qualitative studies included ethnography, direct observation and focus groups. We also found a small number of methods which collected data automatically from the games over a distance. For example, to automatically count the number of users of a game, and these include telemetry and analytics. And finally, also, we found a small number of papers doing literature review, much like my paper. So surveys were used 350 times to evaluate mainly players, whether it was their experience while playing, their motivation for playing, or their personality. The most used surveys was the key experience questionnaire, which was found in 46 papers, followed by the intrinsic motivation inventory questionnaire, which captured players' personality 28 times, and in third position the Big Five inventory for player motivation, which was found in 22 studies. These slides also show other surveys that were used more than 10 times. However, in those 350 instances, studies that used surveys, we found really a lot of diversity and a lot of surveys that were used just once or twice. So talking about surveys and collecting data from players, we're now going to look at how participants were recruited in the studies and how many. As we expected, the quantitative studies tend to recruit a higher number of participants, a minimum of 24 and up to 2,000, which is quite a lot, while qualitative studies usually have less participants. We even found interviews with just one participant and focus groups with a minimum of 5. Participants, also interesting, were mostly recruited through universities, so usually students. This is still the main way to recruit participants, universities. We also found other means, although fewer times, for example, social medias like Facebook or Twitter, and also participants were sometimes recruited through Amazon Mechanical Turk. So if we now look at the tools used, specifically digital tools, we can actually have a better idea how participants were recruited, but also how data was collected and analyzed. So we can see here the digital tools that were used to recruit participants, in particular gamers and players. We have Amazon Mechanical Turk, we have social media. We found 2 main subreddits that were used to recruit participants, which is the game dev and the r/sample size subreddit. And then telecommunication application like Messenger, Skype and Slack, and game websites. We found tools that were used to create surveys like SurveyMonkey and Google Forms. But we also found other tools that were not just used as a mean to create or share surveys, but also to collect content, for example, from posts in social media or game websites that were used to both recruit participants and also collect data. Finally, we found both qualitative and quantitative softwares that were used to analyze the data collected. In vivo, which is the software I used, but also Qualtrics and statistical softwares like SSPS, R, and MATLAB. With this paper, we wish to help game researchers in selecting which methods, tools, and techniques can best fit their purpose. However, our literature review confirms how challenging it can be to choose a survey over another, especially if you want to capture player experience, because there are so many options out there. So many different kinds of surveys available. On the other hand, not many options if you want to evaluate game technologies, as we found just very few instances in which game technology was evaluated. We found a questionnaire we used just once, such as the consumer product questionnaire and the device assessment questionnaire. This is at least in the paper we reviewed. Similarly, we also did not find many studies evaluating serious games in those venues. And the questions we found were never used more than once, except for the physical activity readiness questionnaire, which was used twice, and it was used to evaluate games designed to enhance physical activities. So in future work, we wish to review papers published in venues dedicated to serious games, conferences and journals, and in order to understand how the impact of serious games is evaluated, so which methods are used. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, please ask. You can also contact me via mail at dada21@buff.sc.uk. You can also check my work in my website, www.danieladeangeli.com. Thank you again.
So there's already a few questions, and I'll allow me to, if I may, just summarize them because we have only a few minutes. There seems to be, the main question seems to be, what do you mean by game research methods? Like whether you're covering all game studies or studies analyzing player experience. And secondly, what about maybe humanistic work that doesn't use those methods, but like uses theoretical argumentation, for example, and speculation about criticism and analysis of games?
Yeah, there is a lot of questions. So this presentation was a little bit of an overview. So I found, just to say, because I saw the question, I do explain, we did find, studies where mixed methodologies were used. And also we found questions that were used that were created for a specific study. I think I found like 108 like studies where they created their own surveys. What else? Sorry, can you repeat the question you found?
I think the question is, you frame this as a review of methodologies for game studies or for game research, but do you mean only for player experience? And what about theoretical analyses or philosophical?
Yeah, so I searched for all the methodologies. I found a lot. So I found a lot of analysis on players, which is why I reported a lot of those surveys. But it wasn't only players, and there were a lot of case studies where they were simply presenting the design of a game. There were literature review in different fields. But most of the finding were on players' experience, personality, and motivation. It was not on purpose. It's just through my research I found mostly those. There were others, but in 1,500 paper, the majority were on players. I don't know if you answered the question. But I found a variety of different studies, the literature review on different topics. There were, but in this case, I focused on the players because it's the biggest, the most of the data I found was in players.
Okay. I think there's ample opportunity for more chat on Discord. So we'll move on to the last. Thanks, Daniela, and we'll move on to the last paper in this block, which is by Jack, who'll be doing the presenting. Thank you.
All right. Can everyone see my screen? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Jack Murray, a PhD student in the Text and Technology program at the University of Central Florida. My talk today will be focusing on analog games and computational platforms. And just to clarify, when I say analog games, I am specifically looking at non-digital physical games like board games and tabletop role-playing games or other similar kinds of objects. So before I really get into it, I just want to let everyone know that my slides are available online if you need them for accessibility reasons, either at my website or you can use the QR code, which will be in the bottom corner of the screen for your convenience. So initially, when I began this research, I was interested in exploring the ways that analog games can facilitate specific kinds of computation, namely in what ways do the components and players afford these ways of engaging in these processes. So to begin, I want to clarify what it means when I invoke the term platform. So platform studies has several ways of talking about what platforms are. From more computational direction, platforms are made up of hardware and software environments that function as layered abstractions to facilitate creative production. This often privileges the creation of digital media. More recent platform studies have been interested in the politics of platforms and expanding into the more media ecology area. This allows platform studies to examine the assumptions embedded into the kinds of creativity that are facilitated. As such, platforms don't exist within a vacuum, and the way that they can create knowledge for how we examine them. So I want to draw attention to the debate of platform studies that has been occurring in the field of analog games. Namely, many of the early attempts to use platform studies focused on examining the ability for components of analog games, specifically things like playing cards and the way those facilitate certain types of computation. This approach does a lot at looking into how the physicality of board game components are leveraged to create a type of hardware environment that allow players and designers to both define procedures and execute procedures through the course of play. Following this, discourse began to bring in aspects of the cultural layer of platform studies, namely how social interactions of players and the way they engage with the physical components and how each specific game fosters specific types of interaction and ways that players are expected to engage with the game system, both on a mechanical and a social level. So my conclusion based on this is that analog game platforms are not just the material components, but rather they are a total assemblage made up of players, the physical components, and the specific rules of a game system that define the processes of play. Taken together, these individual pieces account for the way that analog games foster creative production. So for the sake of scope, I limited my research into looking at the way these platforms facilitate narrative play and emergent storytelling. And one of the ways this comes about relies on the procedural generation of content through the systems of a game, the affordance of the hardware, and as well as the procedures and outcomes as they are interpreted by the players. So to do this, I had two case studies. I used specifically Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering because both games are heavily discussed in the current analog game platform studies literature, but also because these games make their reliance on the computational processes and the capacity for storytelling explicit and implicit in the histories of play, but also the methods of play. So to begin with, in Dungeons and Dragons, we see that the rules of the game are codified in such a way that they lend themselves to specific algorithmic interpretations guided by senses of randomness imparted by the dice or the decisions of the players. One way this stands out in particular is through the use of things like random lookup tables that are used to generate content for the players, be it rewards, encounters, or even the personalities of non-player characters. And this has specific implications for how narrative moments emerge during the gameplay based on the outcome of these processes. So in Magic the Gathering, we see that computation relies on the ordinality and textuality of cards, as well as the structures that define how interactions occur during play, and narrative, and through this, narrative emerges in two different ways. First is the apparent application of the theme. So as you play, it references the thematic elements of the game in such a way that it can be reconstructed based on the kinds of cards that are played. As well as the emergence of narrative equity, which relies on the rule systems of the game and the material constraints of the cards. This refers to the possibility for players to do interesting things in the game that can be talked about later. Specifically, computation occurs in Magic the Gathering because the cards function as specific instructions that define how the processes of the game are interpreted. So the paper goes more into both of these case studies if you're interested in reading more about those. So hopefully I've demonstrated the ways that some of the ways that this assemblage of players, components, and rules of analog games afford creativity. So where does this leave us? I would argue that this gives us a new way of thinking about game design with intentionality. In what ways do the players, components, and rules interact? And how do we leverage this interaction to design specific types of experiences that take into account the entire ecology of a platform? This has applications not only in the realm of narrative games, but also educational games, serious games, or persuasive games, as well as other potential areas. I also wanted to, it looks like I'm running up on time, so I want to leave you with a few provocations. So first, if we view analog games as platforms, what does it mean when they're adapted to run on digital platforms such as Tabletop Simulator or other first-party adaptations? What is gained, what is lost, and how does the experience change? Second, how can we design games that take advantage of the player component rule assemblage in ways that facilitate creative play? Thank you all. I'm open for questions.
Thanks, Jack. We have time for one or two questions. Virtual hands up or chat, please. I guess. A quick one. Jack, given the scope of the paper, why do you focus on narrative, and how do you conceptualize narrative for board games dash RPGs or collectibles?
Yeah, so the paper goes deeper into how I arrived at this, but the way I conceptualize it is both the events that arise through the course of play and how players are then able to construct those as either recounting of things that happen where they can say, you know, this happened in our game, or my character did this in the game, and how that is facilitated through the course of play, or things, or even this kind of meta narrative that arises where in competitive games, people tend to say, this is what happened in this specific play of the game. And I would argue that that is another type of narrative, whether it's not necessarily a fictional narrative of the game, but it is a narrative of play that emerges.
We have a question from Colin Strickland. Would changing the context of play change the platform? For example, streaming a D&D game makes it a different platform.
Yeah, so that's one of the, actually some of the current research I'm working on. And I'm really interested in how, especially during the pandemic times and the age of social distancing, like what does it mean to have an analog game platform? Like what kinds of things are lost? And so depending on the way that players are able to adapt to, the game to function in these digital spaces, that might change the context of how the platform functions. Yeah, that's a very interesting question to me, and I don't quite have a solid answer, but if you want, I'd love to discuss that more.
Hey guys, I think there's a lot of threads that we can follow further on Discord, and it's time for us to congratulate the presenters and vacate the room. Thanks everyone.
The next thing coming up is a keynote in room number 1. So please move to the next room. Thank you.